and welcome to this webinar on leveraging pricing signals to achieve policy outcomes. My name is Christine Seibert, and I'm a project manager with the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard University, the host for this webinar series. We're excited to have you all join today to learn from our fantastic panelists about the ways that they have reimagined pricing structures to help support more sustainable transportation. One quick note before we begin. Please mark your calendars for our next webinar on July 23rd at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, on sustainable freight. And I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our fantastic organizers who put this together: Tara Widener, Laura Hanneran, Beverly Jean Lewis, and Thais Pinheiro. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Kyle Schroeckenthaler. Kyle is the Vice President of EBP US. He is a transportation policy and planning consultant with a strong background in economics, public affairs, and infrastructure analysis. His interest in transportation was sparked during a formative year abroad in Beijing, where the contrast between large-scale infrastructure investment and environmental degradation led him to pursue a more grounded, impact-driven career. Originally from Wisconsin, Kyle moved to Boston to join EBP for 10 years ago to serve with DOTs, MPOs, and transit agencies around the country, as well as conducting national level work for the U.S. Department of Energy, Transportation Research Board, Federal Highway Administration, and others. He holds a master's in public affairs from the Lafayette School at UW-Madison, where he specialized in applied economics and cost-benefit analysis. He is the research coordinator for TRB's Committee on Economics and Finance. Now based in Minneapolis, Kyle works on transportation planning, equity analysis, and infrastructure strategy, motivated by a belief that better transportation systems can directly improve quality of life and economic opportunity. A key part of his work focuses on revenue policy and equity analysis as part of EBP's mission to help clients shape a more sustainable future that considers a wide range of stakeholders and economic, environment, and societal considerations. To Kyle as our moderator.
It's always exciting listening to someone else introduce you, even more awkward than introducing yourself, but I'm very excited to be here with everyone today, and guess I get to give the same treatment to my co-panelists. So we have a great lineup today, very excited to talk about a really diverse set of pricing and repricing innovations that are taking place across the country. So I'm going to give a little bit of introduction on pricing as an economist, I guess, and then Will Feeney, who's a part of the Sustainable Transportation Programs branch at the District Department of Transportation, who works on transportation demand management and micromobility, will be sharing more about his experience managing the district's parking cash out program. Fun fact about Will is he enjoys a sensibly priced parking space. Maybe we all do. I sometimes feel really good when I pay $3 for street parking because that is some really valuable real estate. Tara Widener is the Climate Impact Program lead with Oregon DOT's Climate Office. She's a registered professional engineer and has over 25 years of public and private experience in modeling and analysis of multimodal transportation systems. Nearly a third of that with ODOT. Her career is focused on quantifying the complex interactions of transportation, land use, and the environment. In the Climate Office, she leads greenhouse gas scenario planning, inventories performance measures, agency funding from a climate lens, and also coordinates climate mitigation policies, plans, and projects with state and local partners. Ben Furness has joined Transportation Alternatives just this last January. He was previously with Cornell University's 2030 project, which is a climate research initiative. Previous to that role, he spent 8 years in the New York City Mayor's office, focused on sustainability and infrastructure. At New York City, he was one of the early architects of the city's Vision Zero plan and worked to advance nation-leading initiatives to clean up the city's buildings, develop renewable energy, expand worker protections, and embrace sustainable transportation. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 daughters and is a longtime cyclist and advocate for safer streets, better public transit, and a more livable city. So I will throw some slides up here and introduce you all to the DOL discipline of economics. Which I'm sure everyone really wanted to spend their Wednesday afternoon on. So hopefully it will be a very quick perspective on my thoughts on Pricing Economics 101, a little bit of information on government pricing today, and some considerations for our topic of pricing and repricing, including a household perspective, government finance perspective, and then a broader societal view. So I will give a few brief examples and then turn it over so we can really get into more details with our great panelists. So I want to introduce, say a few words about the user pays principle. There's different ways we can think about pricing, and one is thinking about making sure the user pays proportional to the costs that they impose on the system. Oregon actually is the national leader in highway cost allocation studies and understanding how different user groups impose costs on the system and receive benefits. I think something I will say a few more words on later is about how this doesn't just mean the cost of infrastructure, but also this can be really complicated because, sometimes the person benefiting from transportation is not a traveler, right? When we think about freight and deliveries and, all kinds of services and supply chains and things like that. Another thing that is often not part of current pricing practice, and one reason we may think about changing prices or repricing things, is whether or not pricing considers the full costs of what users impose on the system. So, there is economic literature on setting taxes so that users recognize the costs that they pay, right? And examples of that would be carbon prices or congestion pricing. We'll be talking a little bit more about both today. And I think there's also, some split between the prices people realize they pay for transportation, their true costs that, travelers bear, and then that cost to society. And really the difference between those two lighter bubbles is part of the work that I've been involved in on repricing. Two other 101 topics, I guess, is trying to set prices and revenue policies that are efficient in collecting revenue. And we get a little bit into the funding picture here as well, right? So besides pricing things so that people realize their costs, most of the time when we price things, it's also because we want to be able to spend the money, right? So we want pricing and revenue tools that are sustainable over time, that provide fiscal stability and aren't really volatile, and that reach those goals that we identify, right? And we can all debate what the correct level of that is, but here I will be more of a planner and less of a revenue economist. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to continue to improve our funding allocation and making sure we can spend money efficiently. I think, there's trade-offs as well with flexible funding, but the more that we can, invest to meet our goals instead of investing within modal silos or geographic or programmatic silos, the more opportunity we have to improve accessibility and choice for travelers and non-travelers and make sure that we get the most bang for our buck, right? So I want to give a little overview of, what we understand to be how states currently price transportation, right? About 73% of state and local spending on highways is covered by state and local road user taxes of some kind, as well as federal money that's distributed to the states. Historically, the Highway Trust Fund has been full of federal gas tax revenue, but when we say 73% is covered by use taxes and we include federal revenues, that's not really the case anymore. Some years up to 40% of federal Highway Trust Fund revenues are coming out of the general fund transfers into the trust fund, so mostly coming from income taxes, right? So that again gets to whether we have a user pays principle or everyone pays, which maybe everyone pays is more a progressive taxation system. But there's only 3 states that are covering all their highway spending through user fees. That's Delaware, Montana, and New Jersey. And a lot of Montana is also federal support. So the lowest are Alaska, where we have a lot of revenues from oil leases, as well as North Dakota and South Dakota, where they have some similar other funding sources. And the big 3 pieces of user revenue are gas taxes, registration fees, more so than licensing, and tolls, where we have New Jersey collecting 50% of its revenue from tolls. 55% of its spending is covered by toll revenue. But the reason we want to put this up there is just show how different pricing systems are in different states, right? Where, some states like West Virginia are collecting almost nothing from registration fees and vehicle fees, whereas California gets a huge share of its revenue from a per vehicle fee rather than a usage-based fee, right? Ohio is the state that's covering the most revenue by gas taxes, which in most states is the best approximation of a usage fee, and it's only at 49% of spending. So a few other stats on levels of toll revenue. For every lane mile in New Jersey, almost $33 of tolls are collected, which is far higher than the US on average. So besides those user fee sources of revenue, there are a lot of non-user revenue sources. Sometimes those are general fund distributions in terms of sales taxes and income taxes. Sometimes states and especially localities have dedicated sales taxes. It could be a 0.75% or something on everything sold. And sometimes we have certain things like vehicle sales taxes that are dedicated to transportation. In Minnesota, that's almost 1/3 of our revenue comes from vehicle sales specifically. And then many places in the country direct property taxes on vehicles, which are people's second largest asset in many households, to transportation. Virginia is famous for this being one of the largest highest states in terms of property tax. So this represents more than 40% of state revenue collected for transportation. The difference from the 73% on the last slide is that federal component. So if we look at the local level too, I think in a lot of our policy discussions at the national level or state level, we forget about how much local revenue goes to fund local roads and highways as well. This is about 40% as much revenue collected for transportation at the local level as the state level. And there's a lot of things tangled up that state decision makers and local decision makers do need to think about. But local jurisdictions make a lot of decisions about state dollars as well. So when we talk about changing pricing, when we talk about repricing existing policies, that's going to interact with a lot of different jurisdictions as well. And mostly talking about highway spending, it is a huge share of US spending. But when we start talking about transit agency operating budgets and capital budgets, things get even more complex, and there's even more ways that different jurisdictions do things. Some of the big sources for local revenues are general fund transfers, things that come in and then are dedicated to transportation, as well as dedicated property taxes, local option fuel taxes, locally managed toll revenue, and parking revenue. So I want to introduce the concepts of repricing and pricing. When we talk about repricing, I think there's a big opportunity for us to shift how people experience the price of transportation without changing things a lot. And the goal of that is really to encourage behavior change through improved transparency in pricing mechanisms and making sure that people are educated about what it costs to travel, what it costs to maintain roads and facilities, and things. So by making costs more salient, but making sure they continue to be convenient to pay, there's an opportunity to hopefully encourage people to think about alternatives to driving as much or consider how they drive and things. And one opportunity we've identified is that by turning some things that we pay once a year or that have a fixed lump sum payment into a usage-based measure, we might lower the barrier to people being able to afford insurance and drive more safely, or people being able to purchase a vehicle that rely on automobility but are not going to drive very much per year, where vehicle sales taxes or vehicle registration fees, these kind of annual lump sum payments could be really prohibitive to people having access to automobility. So this kind of contrasts to the idea of creating new pricing mechanisms, which hopefully give us an opportunity to address underpricing of specific policy objectives, even if that's infrastructure investment needs, rather than just setting a revenue target. Almost everywhere in the country, as we just looked at, prices are lower than infrastructure costs are, and almost nowhere in the United States do we price any of the costs of the society that travelers impose. So, by increasing revenue levels through more pricing, better price signals to affect behavior, we may also be able to save households and society other indirect costs of poor facilities, poor accessibility. So there's a lot of implicit costs to transportation, whether you are a driver or not a driver today, that might be better addressed through explicit prices. So these other three perspectives on housing, on households, governments, and society, right? So want to not too close to the climate change piece of the webinar here, but I think a lot of times when we talk about government revenue programs, we may forget how many other costs that policy doesn't regularly affect there are involved. For most households, transportation is the second largest expense. And for some of our lower income households, it can account for more than 40% of household income in transportation expenses, right? And this is for households that do own vehicles. And on average, it's more than 10% of income, even for the highest 20% of households, right? And a huge share of that is the cost of vehicles themselves, as well as insurance, right? So a lot of times we think about, we do add in maintenance and repairs to those fuel costs. But when I do a lot of work on transitioning gas taxes to road usage charges. And in most states, a tiny fraction of this fuel cost for households is government revenue component of it. The other thing that the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't include in transportation costs is parking, which, depending on where you live, can be a really huge part of your household transportation expenditures and isn't included in kind of these costs at all either. So thinking about what government entities are dealing with right now in terms of transportation revenue and whether prices are correct, we have a lot of inflation over the last 5 years since 2020. If you think your groceries have gotten really expensive, the cost of delivering a highway project has more than doubled since 2020, which is really thrown a wrench in a lot of budgets at operating agencies and infrastructure owners. And on the other side, we just have a long trend of, forecasts show that we expect a lot of degradation in the amount of revenue coming from fuel taxes over the future, and the ability of that revenue to support investments as we forecast future inflation, even if we get back on this more normal track, right? This graph here is just the current CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards that are part of law today, right? There's a chance they could be paused or changed, but by 2050, we could have 50% less gas consumption, even based on federal standards, right? Not any faster electrification or things like that. And then here I get into a bunch of numbers and algebra, I guess, but I want to just throw out some of the other costs that are not currently considered in a lot of our pricing today. At the top here, just a comparison, if we think about gas costing around $3.50 a gallon and maybe a representative vehicle getting 25 miles per gallon, their fuel costs are only 14 cents per mile, right? And even in California, with the highest gas tax in the country, only 3.5 cents of per mile is collected for infrastructure investments, right? If we look at the cost of traffic fatalities and injuries, or vehicle property damage alone, we're talking about around 50 cents per mile of risk from traffic crashes, right? That's a huge amount of societal value, the highest, in our opinion. We do have, these are my estimates, I guess. There's some research from the 1997 National Highway Cost Allocation Study that says that the marginal cost of an extra mile of driving is 10 cents in rural areas and 2 cents in urban areas. Still pretty significant compared to what these is all indirect costs that we pay through loss of life or loss of productivity, disability, things like that, right? I would say that on average, the cost, I think I use something like 25 miles per gallon as well. The cost of greenhouse gases on average in today's fleet is around 11 cents per mile, right? Congestion is also, up to the same level that we're currently paying in terms of costs imposed on others by a marginal mile of driving. Local air pollutants cost billions of dollars a year in public health costs. It is only around 1 cent per mile. Noise is also very small, but we know these values are again from 1997 National Highway Cost Allocation Study. There's not a lot of great research when we've looked at the US literature. Europe has much, much better literature today on the costs of noise pollution. But another huge cost could be, just how much land use we dedicate to roads and to parking as a significant amount of our urban footprint. So, there is a lot of work being done on this in this realm of pricing and repricing today. Gas tax increases are happening across the country to try to meet funding needs. A lot of states have imposed electric vehicle fees, which I think in most states is seen as a convenient and hopefully temporary solution until we have something better, but recognizing that there's a lot of change happening right now. And a lot of states, therefore, are looking at distance-based fees, which vehicle telematics may make an option going forward. There's a lot more technological possibility today, both on the vehicle side and on the agency side. Other repricing and pricing to consider: fare-free transit programs, changes in insurance models. Will share a lot more information about parking cash out and how it can help manage regional travel demand and equalize different modes. Congestion pricing, Ben will share more information. A few states have passed delivery fees to try to capture some of that indirect usage of the transportation network and pricing vehicles. So I want to share a little bit about some work that FHWA did a couple years ago. We've supported them in developing a model that looks at repricing vehicle sales taxes, vehicle registration fees, property taxes on vehicle ownership, usage-based insurance, highly variable insurance pricing, parking cash out, and changes in how leases are assessed. And this is a simple, like elasticity-based model that does account for some rebound effects and stuff in each of the 50 states. But just looking at these existing fees, not really increasing the cost of transportation at all, literature suggests we could see something like 25% reduction in national travel in the long run, right? Obviously, we need a lot of investments in other modes and things, but this is without significant new costs to drive. So Scott at Oregon will share a little bit more about their progress on implementing road usage charges. We do have, 5 states where maybe by the next couple of years we will have permanent programs, and many states studying and piloting programs to charge at least some drivers based on how much they drive instead of how much fuel they consume. In Hawaii has a permanent program. Almost all of these, except for Virginia, are focused on electric vehicles. But as fleets transition, I think we'll have a lot of opportunity to scale those, and many of these states have that vision. And so this map is a couple years old, and there's been additional activity in places like Wisconsin, and some of the states here have done additional research, Louisiana. So hopefully that's a helpful, very broad view of some of the objectives of repricing and pricing. I think there's some very clear, the main reason that we want to change behavior of drivers is to, achieve greenhouse gas savings over the long run, but also, save households money as well. So I will now transition it to our great panelists. Will Feeney will be up first to talk about repricing commuter parking a little bit, and then he will pass it off to Tara Widener and Scott Boardman, and then Ben will close us up. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Kyle. Appreciate the transition there, and a great presentation on pricing and repricing. All right, my name is William Feeney. I'm with the District Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to be talking about the Transportation Benefits Equity Amendment Act of 2020, more commonly known as the DC Parking Cash-Out Law. And to use some of Kyle's terminology to frame this, this would be an example of repricing the alternatives to driving and parking. And it's taking place at the municipal level with a potentially regional effect. So let's get into it. All right, so a bit of background. The DC Parking Cash-Out Law was passed in 2020, just before the pandemic really hit. So it took a little bit of time to get off the ground. It was started being fully implemented in 2022, and we began our first full reporting period in 2023. So that's where our data goes back to. So to give you an idea of the reach of this law, if you are an employer in the district and you have 20 or more employees who either work full-time or spend more than half their working hours locally, you are going to be covered by this law. And that second provision there is to capture the impact of telework, which was still quite widespread in 2022, 2023. A little bit less so now, but still very much a factor. All right. Now, if you are a covered employer and you offer free or subsidized parking, you're going to have to implement a compliance option. There are 4 of them. The first is the parking cash out option, which we refer to as a clean air transportation fringe benefit. You can also choose to pay a clean air compliance fee. It's going to be $100 per employee who is offered a parking benefit on a monthly basis. You can also develop and implement a transportation demand management plan that has some pretty specific goals associated with it. And we offer complimentary assistance creating those through our outreach program, Go DC Go. And you can also decide to just stop offering that parking subsidy entirely. I do want to note that two of these compliance options are cost neutral, and oftentimes, based on our analysis, the parking cash out option will reduce in savings for an employer who fully implements it. All right, to delve a little deeper into the four different compliance options. So with the parking cash out option, it's going to be a fringe benefit. So that's the language from the tax code. It's going to be equal to the fair market value of the parking benefit. And I'll get into that a little later on. And it can be used for either transit expenses or it can be taken as taxable income. I already mentioned the second option, and that's just about as much detail as there is on it. I'll add that it is paid to the DC treasurer and that it goes into the general fund. If you choose to implement a TDM plan, you're going to need to demonstrate either that you are under a 25% drive alone rate across your organization, or that you are showing a 10% reduction year over year. Actually, both of these are pretty achievable. And we've seen some really great success with this option. And then, of course, if you choose to get rid of your parking benefit, all you have to do is just tell us that you did that. Now, there are a number of exemptions. So if you own your parking, you are exempt. If you are a federal agency, you are exempt. If you are party to a parking lease that was signed before October 2020, you are exempt. If you have an existing campus plan, which you pretty much only have if you are a university or a large hospital complex, you're exempt. And of course, if you don't offer parking benefits. All right, I want to run through the process of sort of the theory behind parking cash out, and then I'll follow up with what exactly we do in the district. So if you are an employer in a dense urban area, um, let's say you choose to offer a 100% subsidy so your employees don't have to pay for any parking at all. It's very generous of you, but perhaps not the most economically sensible thing to do. Now, each parking benefit does represent a indirect payment to an employee, right? You're not giving them the money, but you're giving them money for a specific purpose, that is parking. It's being funneled directly to that, and they pay either nothing or a reduced rate. Then if you see that when you cash out that option, the employee who had the subsidy in the form of a parking subsidy previously can instead take that as a direct payment, and in return they give up their parking space. They can then use this money for commuting costs or for whatever purpose they so choose. Oftentimes, if you have significant enough uptake, this will give employers the option to downsize your parking operations, which can be pretty expensive to run. So that can lead to very high cost savings. Now that's the theoretical. Here is how we implemented it in DC. So as I mentioned, if you are an employer of 20 plus employees, you're covered. And if you offer a subsidy for parking, you have to implement something. Now, of course, there are other options, but this employer in question offers the Clean Air Transportation Fringe benefit. Next up, the employer does have to do some math, and we have tools available to help with this. They need to take the median publicly available monthly off-street parking price from values within a quarter mile of the office. And I'll have some slides detailing what this actually looks like in just a bit. But it is a bit of a precise process. It's not just a question of taking the amount you subsidize and directly offering that as a theoretical cash out program might rely on. And then every employee who is offered the parking benefit across the organization now has the option to continue taking that parking benefit or choose the Clean Air Transportation Fringe benefit. Now, I want to get a bit into the mechanics here. As I previously mentioned, they can take it as a transit subsidy, or they can take it as taxable income, or an additional employer contribution to employee healthcare expenses. Now, I don't believe we've ever seen that happen in practice, the healthcare expenses part, but it is an option. Also, if you are estimating your transit expenses and it is less than the full amount, you can get the remaining amount of that benefit as a direct taxable income contribution. All right, so here's what the fair market value actually looks like on paper. As I mentioned, you have to take the median publicly available monthly off-street parking price within a quarter mile. So we built a tool that when you type in your address, it will show you every monthly off-street parking rate within that area. Now, I actually think this area just south of DuPont Circle in Foggy Bottom is a pretty indicative part of the city because on the south side of M Street, you can see there is a real density of parking spaces. Almost all of these large buildings are going to have some sort of underground garage, and there are a handful of garage structures or the occasional street lot as well. But when you go north of M Street, you start getting into this more like a mixed use or majority housing area, and you're going to see a lot fewer of these parking facilities and also lower rates. Um, and this bump out on the left shows you what an employer sees when they click on a space. So we're going to get the facility type, price, and where it is. So one problem we ran into with implementing this is we had no data set of off-street parking prices. We had plenty of information on our, on-street hourly rates, but we did not know outside of a broad colloquial sense or just asking colleagues, how much they paid the past weekend when they parked somewhere downtown, what the rates were. So we relied on two different sources, Spot Hero and Colonial Parking, Spot Hero being a nationwide, potentially international data aggregator of parking prices, and then Colonial Parking being a more local, but quite widespread across the region parking provider. And across the central business district, they have very wide coverage. So we had a really good data set that we could build out of these two providers. Now, two more points on the fringe benefit I want to mention before I start talking about the impact. The fair market value, while it is a bit complicated and you have to do some math, there's some geography involved, it does ensure that the benefit is meaningfully related to the cost of the parking benefit geographically, right? So if you are in the downtown area, but your employer is offering you a $50 subsidy, a typical cash out program would see you offered that $50 as a just cash value. And it's nice, but it's not really going to compete with a free or the benefit of having a reduced parking space. However, if the fair market value of the parking space is much closer to, let's say, $300, getting $300 to spend on transit monthly or for whatever you so desire, that's going to be much more attractive, and that's going to be a great incentive to shift you away from driving and parking towards transit, towards biking, towards carpooling, what have you, any sort of non-single occupancy vehicle mode. I also want to note that if you offer this benefit, you are only required to offer it. You do not have to, give it to everyone and spend a bunch of money. All you have to do is send an email to your employees saying, this is an option, you now have a choice. So there's a lot of flexibility inherent to this law. All right, so I want to talk about the output of our previous program year, which was our largest reporting cycle to date. So 1,094 employers across the district completed the reporting process. 65% were exempt, and you recall that there are a wide number of exemption categories. Almost all of the exempt ones were simply not offering a parking benefit, which is great. That's really good data to have that we did not have previously. Of the ones who implemented an option, 127 chose to offer the parking cash out. 64 implemented a transportation demand management plan, and 41 chose to pay a clean air compliance fee. And we didn't explicitly track this, but 11 employers told us directly that they did choose to stop offering a parking benefit as a result of this law. All right, I want to give a bit of detail on the TDM plan and compliance fee options. So 40 employers paid this past year. Totaling that amount, that was over $1 million going to the general fund. Now, we would be thrilled if these employers chose to offer a fringe benefit or create a TDM plan. But this was, of course, an option as well. So, we're also happy to have that money going to the general fund. Uh, of our TDM plan employers, 56% either achieved for the first time or maintained a driver loan rate of less than 25%, which is fantastic. 75% of employees taking transit, riding a bike, walking, whatever they want to do. That's not driving alone. And all but 4 of our employers hit that target of reducing their driver loan rate by 10% from the previous year. So we were really excited with that. All right, and to summarize some final impact statistics, we incentivized almost 1,600 drivers to switch to a sustainable commute, and that's just looking at the parking cash out impact. I want to note this is a regional impact because many district commuters live in Virginia, live in Maryland, or even further afield. So these are commuters who have chosen perhaps to take the Silver Line in from Virginia, or to take the MARC train down from Maryland. So these have a regional impact. It's not just local. As I mentioned, we generated some revenue at no cost, and we created 60 plus successful transportation demand management plans that will be in effect for the foreseeable future. So thank you. I have my email there if you have any questions. And I'm going to pass it off to Tara, who's going to walk us through the Oregon greenhouse gas reduction roadmap.
Great, thanks, Will. It's really excellent to see these things play out, and there's all those details that you have to work out. So that's wonderful. I'm going to step us back into sort of the big picture of how we plan for and think about sort of the integration of pricing policies in our greenhouse gas planning within the state of Oregon. Okay, are you seeing the right screen? Great. Let's see. I'm here with the Oregon Department of Transportation in the climate office. I've also brought with me a special guest, Scott Boardman, who works in our Office of Innovative Funding, and he'll be reporting on some legislation that we're doing right now that involves some changes to pricing, and particular to the road user fee, that conversion of the gas tax over to a per mile pricing approach. So I'll start out by talking about, this is our big picture. So we have sort of a guiding light here in terms of our roadmap towards greenhouse gas reduction. We have this on a website that you can see there. But overall, we had this plan back in 2012 that was looking at how are we going to achieve this, the goals that were set by our legislature to reduce by 80%. And so we got together a bunch of people and had a handshake of what combination of policies, those policies you can see to the right, would get us to that goal. And so in our website, we have some charts, and the gold line in these charts is really our reduction that we want to achieve, and that's the goal that we're trying to get to. And the blue lines here are what's actually happening in terms of what we think is going on with our financially constrained plans and trends. So the dark blue line is where we're at today. The dashed line is where we were 5 years ago. So we're doing well in some respects. And then we break this down further into, and oh, I should say that pricing is one key piece of that, of the categories of actions for us to get to that goal. If we break that one goal into 2 objectives, as shown here on this chart, we need to absolutely clean up each vehicle mile, and that's where we've made the most progress in the last year. You can see the dash down to the solid and really hitting the gold line that we're shooting for. But we know that that's not enough for us to reach our goals, and so we also have to reduce the growth in vehicle miles traveled, dampen, as we get more population, the growth in VMT. It will continue to grow, but at a slower rate if we can get people to reduce their personal footprint of miles traveled. These again are the categories to fill that gap. The bottom two are supportive of the sort of basically we've adopted the California standards there for Advanced Clean Car 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. The remainder really contribute primarily to reducing that growth in vehicle miles traveled, and pricing being a key one of those. In fact, our modeling has shown that we need not just the carrots that are setting out good programs and even incentives to get people, or good networks, right, bike and walking and transit options that are non-driving. We also need the stick side of the equation, which motivates people to intentionally budget their vehicle travel and take those alternative modes when it's raining, when you have a child aboard and so forth. What's the friction we can get over there? So what does that mean in our plan to say that we have pricing policies and that they're this impactful? So it's really a reworking of existing costs. So the chart on the right has a couple bars of sort of today and then 2050 in a business as usual plans and trends way. And then on the right is our vision. So the bottom part of those bars, the dark blue, is the energy used to power the vehicle, and we know we're moving from gas to electricity, which is cheaper, so that is a reduction in cost there on energy. Orange is the maintenance, repair, and tires, so that maintenance cost is really staying pretty steady. Taxation, as Kyle mentioned at the beginning, kind of small portion of it and getting smaller as we get high efficiency vehicles. The gas tax is just not going as far. But as we look at the STS vision, this is where we start to see some changes. And so we need to move over to that road user fee, so per mile. So we get rid of the sort of inequity of the high efficiency vehicles, but also the vision calls for us to pay for that full cost of the transportation system. And as Kyle mentioned, that can be anywhere from 3% in Alaska is what I heard from user fees up to, full time. I think the rule of thumb I use in Oregon is about 50%. So we need to really double the taxes that we're paying and ideally do that in a per mile way rather than registration fees and lump sums. So that's the vision for taxation. There are other policies going on like cap and trade and carbon taxes that can capture social costs. We're seeing, like in California and other states, even in Oregon, with some of those policies, Clean Fuels Program, that they are increasing the price of gasoline. And so gasoline vehicles see that, so capturing some externalities to some extent. So that is also a price that's paid. But probably that biggest one is what Kyle mentioned as well, is that repricing of insurance. So we're currently paying annual insurance fees or premiums. And then as we shift that to a per mile basis and you really face, with each mile, the cost of driving that you're paying elsewhere, that will really kind of make you prune back and be more judicious in terms of where you drive. And so it's also something we're talking with our legislature right now because, costs are going higher in costs of owning cars and all sorts of things. So trying to bring down those costs, if we can put that in the vehicle owners' hands to say drive less, pay less, this could be a win-win for everybody. So generally we're trying to shift things to per mile from the gas to the road user charge, shift the insurance to a per mile. We're trying to have a little bit of more taxation to cover the full costs of transportation and carbon, so externalities there. And then, but that will compensate for energy costs, which come down. And the idea is you're not paying a whole lot more than you were before, with that green being just a repricing, a shift, not a new cost. We also have other costs in our vision here. There's some registration fees and so forth. The other things I'm talking about here, parking is something people know a lot about, and what we just heard about from Will was this cash out parking that's pretty new to Oregon. So happy to hear more about what's happening in DC. And over on the right is some more conversations in green from the Climate Strategies that Work playbook about pricing parking. And this is a great resource. If you don't know about it, I'd highly recommend going to tap that the USDOD put together in the last year. The second part, or the last element here, is congestion tolls. We have a sort of a small city for the most part in Oregon, except for Portland. And so that's where we envision in our GHG policy to have congestion tolls in that area. And I think this is a really insightful thing when we think about congestion tolls, and hopefully we'll hear with our next speaker that, you know, it's a really small difference of 5% change in vehicles in a congestion area can lead to significant changes. So it doesn't have to be a big pricing program to really have a lot of impact. I won't go into this a lot, but if you do go to our website that talks about this whole vision, it will go into each of the pricing mechanisms we have. Again, this is what we want to do, not necessarily what we're doing at this point. We have report cards to tell us, the public, where we're at with each of the items in our vision. So pricing, you know, really indirectly affects all of the levers in our policy plan. So just trying to bring in some of those feedback and synergies that are happening within the plan. So pricing in a transportation option sense encourages the use of those other modes, carpool, transit, and can also provide revenue to fund them. Pricing can lead people to locate closer to work or transit lines and create those compact mixed-use neighborhoods that can help bring down household transportation costs. When pricing reduces driving, especially peak periods, it dampens the need for new roads. And then even in vehicles and fuels, if you face the full cost of driving, you're starting to being incentivized to purchase a high efficiency vehicle. So all these are working together. And as we've stepped back now from the vision, we're saying, okay, our legislature is having conversations about needing to raise money, particularly on maintenance and operations. So how can we make this a climate-friendly bill was a conversation for my climate office. And so these are the kind of talking points that we were trying to get into the hands of our folks at the table there. And so, you know, talking about, hey, it's more climate-friendly, and really the idea in this sense is you know, trying to get people to face those full costs. It's more climate friendly to have that clear price signal to tie it to usage. And it's actually more equitable than tolling in some sense, because we're like spreading that cost across a lot of people as opposed to particular times in day. And we've had dicey experience with trying to add some tolling into the Portland area. So it's less climate friendly if we you know, don't tie those to the price signal, and that actually continues to perpetuate the underpricing of the cost of travel, all those social externalities and so forth. So that's not as friendly. And also just registration fees and annual fees are sunk costs that dampen that price signal. Actually makes you want to drive more now that you've invested that much to date. So on this chart here, the top of the chart is generating more revenue. To the right of the chart, you get more climate friendly. On the bottom, we have things like studded tire taxes, which have benefits of their own. And then also in that box, we sort of have the annual registration fees, which, you know, are valuable from a revenue sense, but maybe not so much climate sense. When we get to the top box, we're starting to get more of those congestion fees, which doesn't hit as many people. You know, carbon taxes, but our ideal up here, beyond, you know, the road user charge is getting to it, but that ideal is really to get that complete cost to travel, is where we're trying to head. And then in general, as we've had these legislative conversations, you know, we need to reinforce the difference between transportation taxes and transportation costs. So, you know, driving has costs, whether you're in a high efficiency or electric vehicle or in a regular vehicle. And we're trying to get everybody to pay that fair share for the transportation system. And so what we can do in the state is look at that state tax, but we've even heard the federal coming back to say, you know, maybe there's a registration fee on electric vehicles at a federal level. The other costs that are listed there, operation costs, we know for electric vehicles can be 2 to 3 times less than a regular driving vehicle. That's shown in the chart below, which I think is a little old, that I borrowed from Maryland, but kind of states the point there. And then the other the iceberg on the right really talks about the externalities, and we often talk about, you know, vehicle emissions and that being removed with electric vehicles, but there's a lot of other externalities of just driving that remain with having an electric vehicle. You know, there's still manufacturing that vehicle, the impact of cars on congestion and even sprawl, heat islands and tire runoff. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. But But at the end of the day, there is this real or perceived sense that there are kind of penalties being put on electric vehicles. And there's an interesting study here by Atlas Public Policy last year that talks about how, as states are attempting to recoup the gas tax losses from high efficiency vehicles, how is this playing out? And they really do show some kind of real penalties that are being imposed in different states. And particularly, everyone's trying to do this registration fee. But additionally, there's charges at public charging, some taxation on that and so forth. So an interesting resource to tap. Another resource in Oregon that we have used that we've found helpful is bringing forward is the Portland had a regional congestion pricing study and looked at different ways that they could tackle that through a VMT fee, cordon or roadway pricing, congestion pricing, and then parking. And they are finding that that road user fee is a very good sort of middle spot where it is equitable across roads and does give access to jobs and so forth. And it avoids the sort of brown spots over there from the congestion fees where things get shifted to local streets. So it's been a real helpful to get people on board with that road user charge is the way to go. And then one more thought exercise before I close out here is we've been having this interesting conversation in our state, really led by our Department of Energy, about how our energy wallet, so to speak, is going to change. Currently, we use a lot of fossil fuels to not only for our vehicles, but also for our heating our home and our water. And those is this 2024 bar chart of the gray are the fossil fuels, and then electricity. We're spending, for things that we use, obviously, about 20% of our wallet. But as we shift to the future, the idea is both home heating to heat pumps and so forth, and water heat pumps, water heating heat pumps will help us as well as electric vehicles. So there's the capital costs in pink and purple of buying an EV or buying a heat pump, but then a lot of the rest of that energy shifts to that more green color, more electricity and less fossil fuels. So it's an interesting thing to think about how these two sectors interact into a user's budget. So with that, I'm going to transition here to Scott talking about a particular piece of what we had hoped would be signed and delivered at this point, but we are still in the midst in the next week of finalizing on what we hope will be a transportation revenue package. And there's a lot of really interesting things on pricing that I'll share here at a draft level, knowing that they are likely to have some shifting in the next couple days. So the first part is really to change that gas tax that we have. Both increase it and index it to inflation. Indexing is really important, so we don't have to keep going back. And also a big, huge part of this, though, is to shift people over to the road user charge. We've had a voluntary program, but this is starting to add those mandates, not only for the passenger vehicles, the electric and hybrid, but also for delivery vehicles at a double the passenger rate. So this is, that e-commerce impact and trying to make those routings more efficient. There's also a weight mile tax for the freight side. So we're one of a few states that has that, and we're sort of retaining that, but simplifying it. Then you get to the annual fees, title fees, registration fees, and there's been some juggling of that registration to make it more equitable on the gas tax road user charge that Scott will talk to. And then the last piece are these other sources Kyle mentioned, right? So we have some taxes on vehicle sales, both at the user and the dealer side. And then we have a tax on bikes as well, just a straight flat tax of 15 for bikes over $200. And then a really important last piece for us is to fund our public transit service. And that's through a worker payroll tax that we're looking to increase. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Scott Boardman of our Office of Innovation Funding to talk about the program there.
Thanks, Tara. My name is Scott Boardman. I serve as the Innovative Programs Policy Advisor within ODOT's Office of Innovative Funding. Obviously here to talk about basically our existing road user charge program, as well as the legislation that's under consideration right now. I like to think at this point, since Tara and I are working on this together, that we are carpooling on this presentation. So in the spirit of reducing GHG. So you can go to the next slide. So looking at Oregon's revenue streams, our state highway fund is made up of three main sources, and we refer to this as the three-legged stool. The biggest portion of that being the fuel tax. We obviously then have DMV fees, and then motor carriers, which, as Tara alluded to, is this idea of, for heavy duty vehicles, we have a weight mile tax. I saw a comment in the Q&A about, paying not only by the mile, but incorporating weight considerations. And that's something that we do have in Oregon, that vehicles over 26,000 pounds pay not only by the mile, but also based on their weight when traveling through the state. And so this three-legged stool has worked well for a long period of time. But we're getting to the point now that the gas tax leg of that stool is becoming pretty wobbly. And so really what we need is a stool with more legs. And so what you see on the right side is, this concept of roadmap to financial sustainability. It includes these three things still, but we also look at things like electric vehicle fees, indexing to inflation. We have general fund sources here. We actually had a general fund transfer back in our short session in 2024, which is very atypical for the state of Oregon. That's not something that happens very often. That was kind of seen as a big deal. But you see also here some things related to question marks, in that there are likely, future policies that we haven't identified yet, but could be an additional option for diversifying those revenue streams to ensure that we have the money necessary to operate and maintain our transportation system. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that Oregon is known for in terms of an innovative space for transportation revenue, we were the first state to implement an operational road usage charge program. And so that is a voluntary program that has been in place since 2015. And, I think it gets back to something that Kyle was talking about earlier, of this user pays approach, that in the past, the fuel tax was probably a pretty good approximation of the user pays approach when most vehicles were getting roughly similar efficiency. But we know now with the current vehicle fleet that those efficiencies vary much more widely. And so this idea of paying by the mile as opposed to paying by the gallon is a much more, user pay approach that has, people better understand, what they're paying for the use of the system. Next slide. And so here's what we have in terms of the existing fuel tax model for the state. This is based on the vehicle efficiency. At this moment in time, Oregon's fuel tax is at 40 cents a gallon. And so you see the differences here in terms of what various vehicles might pay. Next slide. If we shift instead to this idea of a road usage charge, at least as we have it implemented in Oregon, that truck that gets less than 20 mpg isn't actually eligible for the program. They would remain on the fuels tax, and they would continue to pay the fuels tax and pay their fair share that way. But what you see here is these other vehicles, paying in terms of transportation taxes, a similar or the same fee for their use of the same use of the system. Next slide. This explains our existing program. Went live in 2015. Anybody with a vehicle over 20 mpg can participate and have their fuel tax credited. The RUC rate, the per mile rate, is set at 5% of the fuel tax, which currently equates to 2 cents per mile. Again, they receive credit for any fuel tax paid. We do have supplemental registration fees based on vehicle efficiency, and any vehicles rated 40 plus or fully electric do not have to pay if they join Origo, which is the name of the program. They can choose among account managers, and GPS is not required. Next slide, please. I apologize. I'm trying to move quickly to keep us on track here. So these are provisions in the bill as proposed. I need to emphasize that this has not been passed. It is still under consideration. All of this could change, but you see an increase in the fuels tax. We would then index it to inflation beginning in 2029 with a collar of 0 to 4% annually, so it could only go up a max of 4%. Registration fees would be increased in terms of the base reg. The supplemental fees, however, would actually be reduced in this package. Each category would see a reduction of $20 per year. The big thing here is this idea of implementing a mandatory road usage charge. It is phased in as it stands currently for electric vehicles. First are renewing electric vehicles, then new ones. That requires additional effort on our part to work with dealerships, registering those vehicles at the point of sale, and then both plug-in and hybrid electrics would be subject in future years. We do envision that all vehicles would be brought into this over time, but as it stands now, legislation starts with those highly efficient vehicles. Those that don't want to participate can pay a $340 per year fee in lieu of paying the RUC, and that it also establishes a mandatory RUC program for medium-duty electric vehicle fleets that is double the RUC rate for the passenger fleet, which gets back again to that concept of weight, that they do weigh more and thus should be paying more per mile. Next slide. And this is basically just a representation of assuming 12,000 miles driven for various types of vehicles. Once this new tax mix would kick in 2026, what they would pay. And what you see here is better equity and parity across these types, aside from the hybrid that does not pay RUC. And that's really kind of included still as an example of why we do need these highly efficient vehicles to begin paying by the mile, because if they remain on the fuel tax, they are not paying their fair share compared to other vehicles. And these will all be shared out, obviously. Happy to answer any other questions, but I am over my time, so I want to move on, and I will turn it over to Ben.
Hey, folks. Hey, folks. So I'm Ben Furness. I'm the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. As was mentioned, I spent 8 years in New York City government working on transportation and infrastructure, and I'm very excited to share with you all the latest that's been happening in New York City's congestion pricing program. So here we go. So the program that's come to be known as congestion pricing in the city of New York is a pretty old notion. And for folks who are a little bit unfamiliar with New York City's geography, the main area that has been thought about as a way to manage vehicular traffic has been on the island of Manhattan, sort of below 60th Street. As early as the 1940s, the Regional Plan Association, sort of illustrious New York region civic organization, was thinking about how to manage the rise of automobile traffic. Obviously, the city was built and grew around mass transit, and in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, as we saw the rise of private automobile ownership, there are only so many square feet on the island of Manhattan, and many, many, many people who would love to be able to drive in. And so managing all the externalities associated with private vehicle use into Manhattan is something that's been thought about over the years. In the 1950s and 60s, there were various proposals to toll some of the East River bridges in order to fund the subways. Sort of noted economist William Vickrey, who is sort of a godfather in a lot of the road pricing and vehicle pricing thinking, an economist at Columbia, worked with mayors Impellitteri and John Lindsay in the 50s and 60s, putting together various proposals to do this. Most of them sort of crashed on the rocky shoals of various political dynamics. One thing that he did get across the finish line, though, was the introduction of the Easy Pass, which was something that he was a major advocate for, sort of a way to pay tolls by driving through without requiring a toll booth, and that's something that has made congestion pricing popular. The modern era of congestion pricing in New York City most date it back to 2007 with Mayor Bloomberg, who proposed as part of a long-term planning exercise he called Plan YC. And his vision at that moment was to charge vehicles who were coming over the East River bridges into Manhattan a vehicle fee, and using that revenue to fund transit infrastructure projects across the region. That in 2008, again, was scuttled. It required a state legislative action, and it was scuttled by, at that point, the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, a gentleman named Sheldon Silver, who went on to spend some time behind bars, because New York is a hell of a town. But this notion that this was a potentially, efficient and thoughtful way to raise funds that could be used to support the mass transit system in New York sort of continued in the background, right? It was something that was developed. Different versions of this proposal have been floating around. Fast forward a decade later, in 2017, there were a series of very high-profile subway derailments. A lot of focus at that point on who was in charge of the New York City subway system. For years and years and years, it was just generally understood that the governor of the state of New York appoints the chair of the MTA, and so the governor is sort of ultimately responsible for the subway. At that moment, there was a big fight between the city and the state, and who would fund the next series of investments in order to keep the subway system running. I was sitting in City Hall at this time, but the punchline was that out of all of this political fight emerged a proposal to raise about $15 billion, so about $1 billion a year that could be bonded to support $15 billion in transit and infrastructure projects to help fund a major investment program to modernize the subway system and prevent some of these negative service consequences that we've been seeing. So to step back a little bit, the major goals of the congestion pricing program historically had been, to really reduce traffic in Manhattan, to potentially fund transit, to reduce pollution, and to improve the efficiency of street space. So Kyle, this sort of goes back to a lot of the advantages that you talked about having a more thoughtful price. As we'll sort of see in this history lesson, the price that ends up getting put in place is as much a product of politics as it is of sort of a thoughtful balancing of the costs and benefits. But an overarching dynamic that I think many congestion pricing schemes over the years, and ultimately this one we're trying to resolve, was really this funny inconsistent pricing of roads coming into Manhattan. So you see on this chart, we have a number of free bridges. We have a couple of tunnels going into Manhattan that have a fee associated with them. And what's not on this map is to point south, you have the Verrazano that cuts across Staten Island, which also has quite a high toll. And so a recurring dynamic was that you would have a lot of both truck and commuter traffic going from Long Island to points east, and instead of going over the Verrazano across Staten Island, which might actually be the quickest way to go, because the Williamsburg Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Queensboro Bridge were all free entering Manhattan, they would cut across some of the most transit accessible and heavily congested real estate in the planet, just to avoid having to pay a toll. So we called this bridge shopping, and this was sort of a major recurring traffic challenge that a lot of the congestion pricing schemes were designed to remedy. Here's the congestion zone on 60th Street. Just by way of background, the overwhelming majority of people who come into the congestion pricing zone every day come in via public transit. 75% come in via transit, 24% by car, 1% walk or bike across the bridges. It's a pretty small number, although that's rising. And overwhelmingly, most people, when they are going to work, are not driving into Manhattan. So this notion that you could, impose a bit of a fee on folks who are using a private vehicle to drive into Manhattan and use it to cross-subsidize and support infrastructure across the rest of the region was seen as this very appealing both policy and political opportunity. This is sort of a, consistently congestion pricing in New York is sort of attacked as a tax on the working class. But this really shows, if you look at who is driving and how rich those people are, particularly who is driving into Manhattan every day for work, it is overwhelmingly not lower income people. It's people who have pretty high incomes. Typically, they have a way to park in Manhattan, which means they have a parking place that they can go to, or a parking placard because of their job. So this was done. Fast forward to 2024, right before this congestion pricing plan was about to be switched on. This was in a hot summer of politics. Then Governor Hochul, who actually got cold feet and decided to pause the program. It had been a program, the price of the tolling system was set to be switched on at $15 for every vehicle. Kathy Hochul paused it. Transportation Alternatives, where I'm now the executive director, was part of a big coalition of transit and transportation advocacy groups who sort of sprang into action to try to encourage Kathy Hochul to keep the program going. In October, she decided to switch it back on, but had decided to reduce the price associated with the toll. So it went from being $15 an hour for every sedan entry into the central business district down to $9 an hour. And then when Donald Trump won the presidency, he had run against congestion pricing. Congestion pricing was largely authorized by the state and the city, but it did actually require a set of federal approvals. Those approvals, the Trump administration and Secretary Duffy, the U.S. Department of Transportation attempted to withdraw the federal approval for this. Kathy Hochul at this point decided she really needed to stand up and fight for this program. It had been showing early signs of success. It had been raising much needed revenue for the MTA. And she has been fighting back and has been doing really an incredible job. A sort of side note, Donald Trump, when he was saying that he was going to reverse congestion pricing, it was the first time he ever tweeted with himself with a crown as a king. And so a lot of these like no kings protests that we've seen in recent weeks, a lot of that comes from things that Donald Trump said in the context of congestion pricing in New York City in that fight. So here's the program as it is right now. It's I think you could see it's a combination of thoughtful policy and a little bit of political finagling to get this across the finish line, and crucially to raise the amount of money that it needs to raise. So it needs to raise $1 billion a year in order to be able to support bonds for about $15 billion in transit investments across the MTA region. So 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekends. It's $9 for every sedan. That's reduced from what was originally $15. It is now scheduled to rise to $12 in 2028 to $15 in 2031. This is important because it means you can still bond out for the revenue for a pretty substantial amount of money because the price increases are scheduled. We have higher rates for trucks to really encourage trucks to use really the Verrazano. A lot of the trucks that were going from the airports on across into New Jersey were cutting across Manhattan. That was a big problem. So we really wanted to shift those to the Verrazano Bridge, have them stay on the elevated highways rather than coming down into lower Manhattan. We have an additional $1.50 per trip for taxis or for hire vehicle, Uber and Lyft trips that either start or end, starting, ending, or that touch the congestion zone. And then there's a suite of this was a fight to keep it from being too much of a Swiss cheese dynamic, but a set of low income discounts and some pretty narrow exemptions for people with disabilities, for emergency vehicles and specialized city vehicles. So think snowplows or other vehicles, street sweepers, things like that. And something that is really impressive is that it is working astonishingly. We've seen really dramatic drops in vehicles entering lower Manhattan. We've seen upticks in foot traffic, meaning that people are still coming to Manhattan, they're just coming by transit. Kyle, you mentioned noise. This is one of my favorite stats, that there's been a 70% drop in 311 noise complaints along a lot of the Canal Street and a lot of the lower Manhattan streets that were clogged with bridge shopping traffic in rush hour. And it's generating enough revenue to support the bonds and hitting all of its revenue targets. This was a graph that the New York Times put together. There are fewer cars, traffic speeds are up really substantially, commute times are way up. Local buses in Manhattan are moving faster. There was a concern, and we can talk a little bit more about this, but there was a concern that traffic would shift from Manhattan to the Cross Bronx Expressway. That has happened much, much less than even the folks who were concerned. We've really seen trips shifting to transit rather than shifting from car trips that cut across the CBD to going across the Bronx. So here you can see a drop in actual entries to the central business district. Commuting Car speeds are going up, not to unsafe levels, but it's much more reliable. Bus speeds are going up, and ridership on all the MTA transit systems are also increasing. This was a graph that shows the traffic, the time lost to traffic. This is a region-wide aggregate analysis. The most important thing being that this is not something where traffic has been eased in Manhattan, but has shifted to the Bronx or shifted to Staten Island or shifted to New Jersey. We're actually seeing region-wide travel saving times. No matter where you're driving, there are just fewer cars on the road, and that's leading to a better experience, even for people who are in cars. And you've sort of seen the politics of this and the popularity of this. In Stockholm and London, we saw this very predictable public opinion dynamic where congestion pricing is least popular right before it gets switched on. And then as soon as it gets switched on, this whole swath of people who didn't think it was going to work and need to drive in every day, all of a sudden feel this incredible time savings associated with traffic. And all of a sudden they flip from being opposed to supportive. Right now, the subset of New Yorkers who have the highest approval rating of congestion pricing. So 66% of New Yorkers who drive into Manhattan 2 times a week or more support congestion pricing because they just love how much time they're saving in traffic, being able to come across the bridges. Finally, we are continuing to fight this in court. So the Trump administration several times has tried to withdraw their federal approval. The governor has said that the cameras are staying on. We're not going to switch off the program. And so far, at least, there have been several different court deadlines. This is sitting in federal court in New Jersey. Judge Lyman, who has actually ruled on several previous legal challenges to the congestion pricing program that have happened over the years, has always pretty consistently ruled favorably. And we are cautiously optimistic this will stay in place. And it is working very well. But happy to answer any questions or go into any more details. This was a New York Times article, and you could see me back there feeling very disappointed that we have to do this, but we've been fighting very hard for this. So that's the presentation, but happy to answer any questions and talk about any of the specific dynamics of getting this across the finish line and how we're thinking about it.
And well, hopefully everyone enjoyed hearing from all of our speakers today. The Q&A is still open. We have a few more minutes here in our time slot. If anyone wants to submit additional questions, we've been responding. The panels have been responding directly to folks that have asked questions through texts during the presentation. But I was wondering, Will, if you wanted to talk a little bit about implementation and staffing levels and funding for parking cash out. I think that's a question we've heard from a lot of cities as we've talked about it, and just how implementation might be possible. To paraphrase the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I put a more detailed answer in the Q&A that I believe is publicly visible, but I'll also respond here. So at least for us, there was no specific funding for the program. It's managed and implemented by a combination of existing staff, so myself and another colleague who works on transportation demand management more broadly. And then we also have assistance from Go DC Go, which is it's a DDOT program that primarily focuses on outreach and engagement related to sustainable transportation. So they assisted with a lot of the employer outreach and education that's required to notify employers of the new requirements, and also assist with developing compliance plans such as transportation demand management, policies, etc.
I think we've heard generally from other folks that if municipalities, for instance, have existing TDM programs, there's certainly like a startup sprint, I think Will mentioned in his response, but otherwise this can in the long term kind of fit into existing portfolios as a really effective mechanism. I did receive a question for me about this, what policies, what repricing policies and pricing instruments are available at like a local level instead of a state level. And I think like in places like Oregon, where we have strong progress at the state level, there's certainly more levers for pricing in many state legislative authorities, and even like state insurance commissioners tend to have more power than local governments over things like pay-as-you-drive insurance. As we talk with people about these instruments, parking cash out is a really exciting opportunity. Parking tends to be very local. And some local jurisdictions do have authority over personal property taxes and sales taxes that could offer opportunities. Besides parking cash out, there's a lot of opportunities for parking reform, whether it's regulatory or pricing instruments, as well as other TDM programs that can make a big difference. And places like Portland, Oregon, but also Chicago and many other places have looked at what a local road usage charge, like an area charge, would look like. If, I think there's a lot of opportunity to layer those things on if we get some economies of scale at state or national programs, but it's not impossible at the local level. So, and then New York's shown us that we can get congestion pricing started through accordion. And I think there's a lot of other potential jurisdictions. There's obviously going to be work with state legislatures, but did anyone else, we don't have any more open questions. Is there anyone else among the panelists that wanted to speak to the audience generally about any responses that they had seen in Q&A? All right, well, I think we are going to wrap up. We hope that everyone is able to make the next session as well on July 23rd. There will be a sustainable freight topic in this webinar series. So everyone should be receiving information. If you've registered for this webinar, you should be getting invites for the future ones. And yeah, Christina just shared some of the USDOT work from last winter that was published and is now available at this ArcGIS website that covers some of these climate strategies, including repricing. So thank you all very much for joining us today. It was great having a chance to share.